My name is Vivienne Calloway. I am 34 years old. And the moment I will never forget happened on a Tuesday afternoon in September, inside a bridal boutique on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, when my sister looked me up and down in front of her 3 closest friends, pressed her lips into something that was almost a smile, and said, "Vivienne, I love you, but you're not really a bridesmaid kind of person. You know how the photos are going to look." I was standing near the fitting room entrance, in a velvet chair that cost more than my first month's rent in Cincinnati. I had driven 2.5 hours to be there. I had cleared my entire Thursday and Friday, had pushed back 2 client calls and rescheduled a site visit to make the trip work. I had arrived the evening before so I could be present for the full experience, because Diana had asked me to be there early, and I had wanted to honor that. I had even bought a new blouse for the occasion, dusty rose silk from a small boutique in the Hyde Park neighborhood I visited whenever I was in Chicago, because I had wanted to look like I belonged in whatever version of the day she was creating. Diana had looked at that blouse. She had looked at my practical leather flats, which I wore because I spent most of my professional life walking properties, and had learned to trust my feet over fashion. She had looked at the worn canvas tote bag I carried everywhere, because it held my notebook and my laptop and my files, and everything I needed to move through a working day. She had made a calculation. The calculation took about 4 seconds. The smile that followed took another 2. And then the words came out, light and breezy, the way Diana always delivered the most cutting things, as though they were observations rather than choices. I did not cry, I did not leave. I did not say a word for a long moment. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I looked at her, and I thought about something she did not know. Something that had been true for 11 months and that I had shared with no one except my attorney and my business partner. Diana and her fiancé Maxwell had booked their honeymoon at Halcyon Shores Resort in Door County, Wisconsin. 7 nights in the Azure Suite. Private beach access, a couple spa package, welcome champagne, and a personalized itinerary arranged by our concierge team. They had booked it in February through a travel agency in Naperville. They had paid a deposit of $4,200. The remaining balance was due 30 days before arrival. What Diana did not know was that I had purchased Halcyon Shores Resort 14 months before that afternoon in the boutique. I owned every room she was planning to sleep in. I owned the beach she was planning to walk on. I owned the spa and the restaurant and the dock that extended 80 feet out over Green Bay. I owned the kayaks and the fire pits, and the stone path through the birch trees, and the suite with the hand-stitched linen curtains she had described to my mother as looking like something out of a dream. I owned all of it, and I had owned it quietly, and on the morning of her wedding day she still would not know, not until I was ready. This is that story. Before I go any further, I want to pause and ask you something real. What part of the world are you in right now, and what time is it where you are? I mean that literally. Drop it in the comments below. I love knowing that these stories reach people in different cities, different countries, different time zones, in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning, or on a lunch break, between things that are demanding something from you. And if you have ever been the sister who was deemed not quite the right type, not quite the right presentation, not quite the version of herself her family chose to see, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Every single day, we tell the stories of women who were dismissed and who built something extraordinary in the silence that followed. You are exactly why we are here. Now let me take you back to where this all began. I grew up in Elmhurst, Illinois, the older of 2 daughters born to Robert and Patricia Calloway. My father was a civil engineer who had worked for the same infrastructure firm for 29 years by the time I left home. My mother had taught 4th grade at Jefferson Elementary for 22 years before she retired. We were not wealthy. We were comfortable, which in Elmhurst in the 1990s meant a 4-bedroom colonial on a tree-lined street, a Buick that got replaced every 8 years, 2 weeks at Lake Michigan in July, new school clothes in August, and Christmas that was generous without being excessive. It was a good childhood in most of the ways that count. I want to say that clearly before I say anything else. Diana arrived 4 years after me, and she arrived differently than I did. She was the child who understood, from a very early age, how rooms worked. She had an intuition about people that I did not have, and that I observed with something close to scientific interest as we grew up together. By the time she was 12, she could tell within 30 seconds of entering any space who held the attention, who wanted it, and how to position herself relative to both. She knew how to make adults feel important. She knew how to make other children feel included or excluded with equal skill, depending on what she needed in a given moment. My parents found this charming. My father said it meant she had people skills. My mother said it meant she would never have trouble making friends. I was the opposite. I was the child who read everything, who spent 3 afternoons a week in the library after school, not because I had been assigned to, but because I found it genuinely difficult to leave. Who asked questions in science class that made the teacher pause before answering? Not because I was trying to perform intelligence, but because I actually needed to know. I was quiet and internally ambitious in the specific way that does not photograph well, that does not make teachers write glowing adjectives on report cards, that does not generate the kind of social warmth that families tend to organize themselves around. My mother loved me deeply and did not quite know what to do with me, which is its own kind of loneliness. The patterns established itself early and settled into permanence without anyone ever acknowledging it was there. At family dinners, Diana's stories got laughs. Mine got polite nods followed by a change of subject. At school functions, Diana's teachers reliably had something enthusiastic to offer. Mine would say things like, "Vivienne is exceptional, but she does not always put herself forward," as though not performing one's intelligence in the approved register was a character flaw requiring remediation. When I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with a finance degree and a thesis on small market hospitality asset valuation, my parents made a lovely dinner, and my father shook my hand and said he was proud. When Diana graduated 2 years later from DePaul with a degree in communications and a grade point average that was a full point below mine, they threw her a party with 40 guests, a caterer, and a photo booth in the backyard. I attended that party. I brought a gift from her registry. I ate the catered food and I smiled in the photo booth, and I drove back to my apartment afterward, and I sat with what I had felt, and eventually filed it away in the place where you put the things that are true, but that you cannot do anything useful with yet. After college, I moved to Cincinnati, a regional investment firm that specialized in hospitality assets, meaning they acquired and repositioned hotels, resorts, and event properties across the Midwest, had offered me a position that no other applicant had apparently noticed because it was listed in a trade publication rather than a general job board. I was 23 years old. I had exactly $6,400 in savings, which was enough for first and last month's rent on a studio in Clifton, with excellent natural light and extremely loud pipes, and enough left over for a used desk and a filing cabinet, and 6 months of careful living before I would need to rely entirely on the salary. I worked. I stayed late every night for the first 2 years, not because anyone required it, but because the work was genuinely interesting and I needed to understand every piece of it, the acquisition side and the operational side, and the valuation methodology and the financing structures, and the renovation management and the guest experience design. I read every industry report I could find. I cold-emailed people I admired in the field and asked if they would speak with me for 20 minutes. About half of them said yes. I took handwritten notes and reviewed them afterward and asked follow-up questions. I built a knowledge base and a network simultaneously, and I did it quietly because I had no one in my personal life to talk to about it, and because this work itself was sufficient company. My family interpreted this as isolation. My mother called every Sunday evening and asked whether I was seeing anyone, whether I had made friends, whether I was sure Cincinnati was the right fit. Diana sent occasional photos from brunches and birthday dinners and gallery openings she attended, with the college friends she had kept intact and close. And the subtext of those photos, never stated but absolutely present, was that she had chosen the version of adulthood that looked better from the outside. I did not argue with any of it. I sent birthday cards on time and came home for every Christmas and kept my professional life entirely separate from my family life, not as an act of deception but as an act of self-preservation. I had learned early that my family was not a safe place for my ambitions. They would not damage them on purpose. They would simply look at them the way my mother looked at my graduation dinner, with love that did not know what to do with what it was seeing, and that kind of not knowing has its own particular weight. By 27, I had saved $62,000 and had developed a specific expertise in small resort valuation across the upper Midwest. I understood what made a property viable, what the right location metrics looked like, how to read the renovation cost-to-revenue curves for different property types, how to structure a deal so that the risk was distributed sensibly across the parties involved. My firm let me lead my first independent acquisition at 28. A 40-room boutique inn on Lake Geneva that we repositioned as a weekend destination property. I ran the renovation budget and renegotiated the staffing contracts, and rebuilt the guest experience from the booking page to the checkout envelope. Within 18 months of reopening, the property was producing a net operating income 61% higher than the previous owner had ever achieved. My firm gave me a bonus. I put it directly into savings and kept moving. By 29, I was managing a portfolio of 3 acquired properties simultaneously and had been asked twice by peer firms if I would consider a transition to their teams. I declined both times. I had already identified the property I was going to acquire for myself, and I needed to stay where I was long enough to finalize the preparation. At 30, I left the firm. The property was Halcyon Shores Resort in Door County, Wisconsin, 212 acres on the shore of Great Bay, with 47 guest rooms across the main lodge and 4 satellite cottages. A spa building that had been shuttered for 2 years due to a staffing transition that the previous owners had never recovered from. A restaurant that had been serving good food to not enough people for the last decade because no one had invested adequately in its identity or its marketing. A dock that extended 80 feet into the water and had not had its boards replaced in 6 years, which was a problem I noted in my first site visit and priced into my initial offer accordingly. The property had been owned and operated as a family business for 31 years by a couple from Door County who were ready to retire, and who had been relieved, in our final conversation before closing, to know that whoever was taking over genuinely understood what the place was and what it could become. The asking price was $4,800,000. I put together a private equity syndicate of 3 investors whose relationships I had been cultivating for 2 years. I contributed $340,000 of my own capital. We retained a hospitality attorney in Milwaukee to handle the acquisition structure and a commercial lender in Green Bay for the debt component. The process took 11 months from letter of intent to close. I was 30 years old when I signed the final documents. I drove to Door County the evening after closing and walked the property alone in the late May dusk with my hands in my jacket pockets, and I stood on the dock and looked out at the bay and felt something I did not have a precise name for. It was not triumph. It was more like arrival. I hired Beckett Okafor as general manager. He had run a comparable lakefront property in northern Michigan for 9 years, and came with a reputation for operational precision and genuine hospitality instinct, which is a combination rarer than it sounds. I brought in a design consultant from Milwaukee to oversee the interior refresh, prioritizing the Azure Suite, the spa building, and the restaurant, which I wanted to feel like a destination in its own right rather than a hotel amenity. I sourced new linens from a small textile company in Sheboygan. I rebuilt the spa menu in consultation with a licensed esthetician who had been recommended to me by the manager of a property I had admired in the Fox Valley. I replanted the waterfront garden with the help of a local landscape designer who had grown up in Door County and knew exactly which perennials would survive the lake winters and bloom reliably for guests arriving in June. We reopened Halcyon Shores the spring I turned 32. By the following summer, the Azure Suite was booking 8 months in advance. A travel writer from Midwest Living contacted Beckett's team in July, and the feature published in the fall issue. Our Net Promoter Score ranked in the 91st percentile for boutique resorts across the Great Lakes region. We were, by every measure I had been building toward, exactly what I had intended to build. Nobody in my family knew any of this. Not my mother, not my father, not Diana. As far as they were aware, I worked in some kind of finance-adjacent consulting role that nobody had ever asked enough clarifying questions about to understand properly. I had not lied to them. I had simply not volunteered. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and I had lived inside that difference for years, because my family's interest in my professional life had never extended past the surface of a polite question, and I had long since stopped offering more than a polite question required. Diana announced her engagement in November, 2 years before the boutique afternoon. She called me on a Saturday morning, voice lifted with the specific excitement of someone who has been anticipating a phone call they get to make. Maxwell Prentice had proposed the previous evening at a rooftop restaurant in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. I congratulated her warmly and sincerely, because I was genuinely happy for her. Whatever the texture of our relationship, Maxwell was a good man who treated her well, and she was my sister, and her happiness was not something I had ever stopped wanting for her. The wedding planning that followed consumed the next 20 months of Diana's life with an intensity I had only ever observed in people who have found a project perfectly calibrated to their specific skill set. She was extraordinary at it. She evaluated venues with the rigor of someone conducting due diligence. She assembled a vendor comparison matrix. She created a mood board in a physical binder with labeled tabs that her friends, when they saw it, described with genuine awe. And throughout all of it, she made a series of quiet and entirely unchallenged assumptions about my role in the proceedings, or rather, about the limited nature of it. I was invited to the engagement party, where I was seated at the third table from the back among Maxwell's extended relatives I had never met. I was included in the bridal shower, where I was assigned the gift list because no one else wanted to track it. I was expected to show up, be useful, be grateful for inclusion, and understand without it ever being stated directly that the tier of the celebration I occupied was not the inner one. And then the boutique on Michigan Avenue on that Tuesday in September at 2:45 in the afternoon, with Kendall and Brittany and Reese watching from overstuffed chairs, as my sister looked at me and made her calculation and said what she said. She added, because silence made her visibly uncomfortable, "I just want everything to look cohesive, you know? The girls all have the same bone structure, same height, similar style. It is not about you, Vivienne, it is just aesthetics." Same bone structure, I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. That was the specific reasoning my sister offered for why I would not be standing beside her on her wedding day. That the women she had chosen to surround herself with had the correct geometry. That I did not. That the visual logic of her wedding photographs required my exclusion. I nodded. I picked up my canvas tote bag and I told her that I understood completely, that I wanted her day to be exactly what she envisioned, and that I would be there as a guest, and would support her in every way I could from that position. She looked relieved. Kendall looked back at her phone. Brittany refilled her champagne glass. Reese looked at a fixed point somewhere between Diana's face and mine, which is what perceptive people do when they do not want to be documented as witnesses to something. I said goodbye to each of them and walked out of that boutique onto Michigan Avenue and stood in the September afternoon sun and thought, with complete calm, about everything I was going to let happen next. I did not call my mother that evening. I did not call anyone. I drove back to Cincinnati across 2.5 hours of Indiana highway with the radio off, thinking. Not about what Diana had said, exactly, but about what it had crystallized. She had dismissed me based on a version of me that had not been accurate for a decade. I had allowed that version to persist because correcting it had always felt like it would cost more than it was worth. The blouse she had looked at and found insufficient. The canvas bag she had catalogued and ranked. The flats. The general unremarkability of my presentation as she understood it. All of it based on a model she had stopped updating somewhere around the time I left for college, and I had let her keep it, because I had not believed she could hold anything more accurate. And that night, driving west through Indiana with the windows cracked and the September air coming in dark and cool, I decided it was time to find out whether I had been right about that. In the weeks following the boutique, I did what I always do when I am preparing for something consequential. I moved slowly and precisely. The first call was to Beckett. I reached him on a Wednesday evening and told him that a guest named Diana Calloway, booking under Diana Prentice from February onward, had reserved the Azure Suite for 7 nights beginning the second Saturday of June. I told him I would be on property during that same week and that I wanted the stay teed with the same care we extended to every guest. No special treatment that would signal my involvement. No hints or references to ownership. Just the full Halcyon Shores experience, exactly as it should be. Beckett confirmed every detail and asked no unnecessary questions. That is part of what I value most in him. The second call was to Gretchen Moll, my attorney, who had handled the acquisition and who understood the property's structure at every level. I asked her to prepare a 1-page ownership summary document, acquisition date, capital structure, current appraised valuation, and my name in clean print at the top. Something that would be impossible to misread, and that would not require explanation. She had it to me in 4 days. The third call was to my mother, not to reveal anything but to listen. My mother, when given a comfortable phone call and an attentive ear, shares more than she realizes. In 20 minutes, I learned the rehearsal dinner venue, the wedding location, and the fact that Diana had shown her photographs of the Azure Suite and described it as looking like something out of a magazine. My mother said it sounded absolutely beautiful. I agreed with her and kept my voice entirely neutral, which was one of the more demanding things I did that autumn. Over the following months, I continued working. I took on 2 consulting clients that winter, both hospitality groups looking to reposition underperforming properties, and the work was the kind that absorbs you fully because the problems are layered and interesting. I was also in preliminary conversations with a 4th investor about a second acquisition in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a property I intended to pursue seriously by the following year. My professional life was precisely what I had spent 11 years designing it to be. My family, receiving their regular Sunday calls and Christmas cards and 2-hour holiday visits, had no way of knowing this. And that gap between what they knew and what was true had stopped bothering me the way it once had. I had stopped needing them to see it in order to know it was real. In February, I flew to Door County for a working visit. Beckett and I walked the full property over 2 days. We reviewed the winter maintenance records, the staffing adjustments we had made after an exceptionally busy October season, and the completion of the spa's hydrotherapy room renovation that our contractors had finished in January ahead of schedule and under budget. On the second morning, I went out to the dock at 6:40 in the morning while the property was still quiet. The water in winter was a different color than it was in summer, darker, more interior, and the light came up slowly over the eastern shore with a kind of patience that I have only ever found in places where the land meets large open water. I stood on the dock for 20 minutes in the cold. I thought about what the property had been when I found it and what it had become. And I thought about June. If you are still watching, I want to stop for a moment and ask you something before we get to the part of this story you have been waiting for. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked straight at you and still did not see you? Not because they were cruel, necessarily, but because they had already decided what you were and simply stopped looking past that decision. Drop a comment below and tell me about it. And if Revenge Chronicles is new to you tonight, please subscribe. What we do here is tell the stories of women who were patient and capable, and who let the truth arrive in its own time. That is exactly what is about to happen right now. June arrived. The wedding was on a Saturday, the 12th, at a Victorian estate in St. Charles called the Briar House, surrounded by formal rose gardens that had been Diana's first choice of venue from the moment she toured them. The ceremony began at 4 in the afternoon for moon. I sat in the 7th row on the bride's side, in a dress I had bought from a designer in Cincinnati I admired, deep forest green with a structured bodice and a skirt that moved when I walked. I had worn my mother's pearl earrings. I had done my hair myself into a low knot that I thought was correct for the occasion. I looked, I believed, entirely like myself, which was the only version available to me. Diana was genuinely beautiful. I want to say that without any complication. She had chosen a gown with a cathedral train and lace that covered her shoulders like something architectural, and she came down the aisle in the golden late afternoon light with an expression that was entirely undefended, completely present, and I felt something soften in my chest at the sight of it. Whatever our history, she was happy. Maxwell's face when she appeared at the end of the aisle was the face of a man for whom this specific moment was exactly what he had hoped it would be. The vows they had written themselves were specific and genuine, and had the small imperfections of something that had not been polished to the point of losing its original voice. I was glad to be there. I was genuinely glad. The reception followed in the same venue, dinner at round tables in ivory linen. The bridesmaids, Kendall and Brittany and Reese, were in a dusty blue that did, I noted with something that was not quite irony, photographed beautifully in the golden hour light that was doing extraordinary things in those gardens. They were at the head table with Diana and Maxwell. I was at table 7 with 2 of Maxwell's colleagues from his architecture firm, a cousin of Diana's I had met at 2 previous family events, and my Aunt Beverly, my mother's older sister, who had driven in from Rockford, and who was one of the few members of my extended family I had always found genuinely easy to be around. Beverly leaned over to me during the salad course and said quietly that I looked wonderful. I thanked her. She paused and then said, "I always thought Diana made a mistake not including you up there." I looked at her. She had not been in the boutique, no one had told her. I asked if Diana had said something to her. Beverly patted my hand. "She didn't have to, sweetheart. I have been watching you 2 for 30 years. My parents visited my table briefly after dinner. My mother said I looked lovely. My father asked how Cincinnati was treating me. I said very well. He nodded in his standard way, the nod that signals a topic has been adequately covered. Diana swept by once with her dress gathered in one hand and Maxwell's arm in the other and stopped to kiss my cheek and say she was so glad I was there. I told her she was stunning, which was true. She moved on to the next table and the dancing started, and I stayed until 9:30 and then said my goodbyes and drove north. Not to Cincinnati, north, toward Door County, toward the property. I had booked myself a room in the main lodge for 5 nights beginning Sunday, arriving the day before Diana and Maxwell, who were due Thursday. I arrived Sunday afternoon. Beckett met me at the lodge entrance. We walked the full property, and then sat in my office behind the main building, reviewing the spring season numbers, which were better than I had projected. The spa reopening had created a significant lift in midweek occupancy. The restaurant collaboration with a Door County winery we had launched in April was generating consistent bookings from guests who were coming specifically for the pairing dinners. I sat with the financial summaries and felt the deep, specific satisfaction of something working the way you designed it to work. Thursday morning I was in the office at 10:45 when Beckett appeared in the doorway and said simply, "They're here." I did not go to the lobby. I positioned myself at the window that looked out over the entry drive, and I watched Maxwell's gray SUV come up the gravel approach, and the valet team move forward with the practiced warmth that Beckett had spent 2 years building into every member of the front-of-house team. Diana stepped out of the passenger side and stopped. She stopped completely, weight shifting back slightly, and she turned in a slow half-circle taking in the trees, the lodge facade with its fieldstone and dark timber, the stone path that curved toward the water, and the first glimpse of the bay between the birches. I could see, even at that distance, the expression on her face. It was the completely unguarded look of someone receiving exactly what they had hoped for. I let 2 full days pass. I let them settle into the property, use the spa, eat at the restaurant, sit on the dock in the long evening light that Door County does so well in June. I let the welcome champagne be enjoyed, and the complimentary 4th-day spa treatment be booked, Beckett's team having arranged it as per my instructions with only a brief handwritten note, indicating it was a gift from the property. Saturday morning I came down to the main restaurant at 8:15 and was seated at my corner table near the window. I ordered coffee. I brought my notebook. At 8:42 Diana and Maxwell walked in. She saw me immediately. She saw me because she was scanning the room the way she always scanned rooms, quickly and comprehensively cataloging who was there. She saw me and she stopped. Maxwell walked into her shoulder from behind and said something I could not hear from across the restaurant. She did not answer him. I looked up from my notebook. I gave her a small smile, calm, unhurried. "Vivienne?" She said my name as if checking whether I was real. Good morning, I said. She came to my table slowly, Maxwell a step behind her, both of them navigating between chairs with the uncertain movement of people who are not sure what they are walking toward. She stopped 2 feet from me. What are you doing here? Having breakfast, I said, and I lifted my coffee cup slightly. But, how did you know we were? Did you know we were coming here? I did, I said. I have known since February when the booking came through. A silence. I watched her working through the sentence. When the booking came through, she repeated. What does that mean, when the booking came through? I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and placed the document Gretchen had prepared on the table between us. 1 page, clean header, my name in standard type at the top, capital instruction date, current appraised valuation, majority owner and managing partner, Vivienne Elaine Calloway. Diana picked it up. She read my name. She read the acquisition date. I watched her work backward from it, watched the arithmetic move through her face as she calculated what 14 months before this week meant, in relation to the timeline of her own life. She had been planning this honeymoon for 8 months. I had owned the property for 14. She had booked the Azure Suite before I owned it. I had acquired the property before she arrived. Both things were true, and both were in the document. You own this resort, she said. I do. You own this resort, and you let me book the suite. I confirmed your reservation personally, I said. I wanted you to have the full experience. Maxwell had read over her shoulder. He looked at me with an expression that I found genuinely difficult to categorize. Part surprise, part recalculation, part something that looked almost like relief, as though a thing that had been slightly off had just been adjusted into alignment. He sat down across from me without saying anything yet. Diana sat a moment later, the same way, without appearing to choose to. The restaurant around us had gone quiet in the particular way a room does when enough people are paying attention without appearing to. There were 6 other tables occupied. The server had found a reason to pause near the service station. Beckett appeared in the doorway from the lobby corridor, noted the situation, confirmed with a brief glance that this was proceeding as intended, and found a reason to check on a table near the far window. How long have you been doing this? Diana asked. Her voice had changed, the social performance had left it, and something more direct had taken its place. 12 years, I said. I left my firm at 30 to acquire this property independently. Before that, I spent 7 years at a regional hospitality investment group, learning the full acquisition and repositioning process. Before that, I studied finance at U of I, specifically because I had identified this field as what I wanted to do with my working life. She looked at the valuation figure on the document. I watched her understand what it meant. Then I watched her understand what it meant relative to every assumption she had ever made about me, assembled over years from the canvas tote bag and the practical shoes and the blouse she had looked at and found insufficient in a boutique on Michigan Avenue on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Vivienne. She said my name very carefully. You do not have to say anything right now, I told her. I want to be clear about something. I did not arrange this moment to humiliate you. I arranged it because it was time. I have spent years allowing the assumptions to stand because correcting them always felt like it would cost more than it was worth. But in that boutique in September, something changed for me. Not because of the specific thing you said, but because I understood that you had made every decision about who I am based on a model of me that stopped being accurate 10 years ago. And I had allowed that. I had allowed it by never showing you anything different. This is me showing you something different. Maxwell spoke for the first time. His voice was measured. Diana told me she did not include you in the wedding party, he said. She told me it was about aesthetics and visual cohesion. He looked at his wife with an expression that was careful and direct at once. I want to come back to that. Diana looked at the document in her hands. When she said she was sorry, the apology came out stripped of all the usual packaging. No setup, no softening, no performance. Just the 2 words and then a pause. How long have you known about the honeymoon booking? Since February, I said. 11 months. You have known for 11 months and you said nothing. I was waiting for the right moment, I said. This is the right moment. She looked out the window at the bay. The water was deep blue and very still in the morning light. Maxwell poured her a glass of water from the carafe on the table. She held it in both hands without drinking. The server came and took our orders and retreated. I ordered the seasonal egg dish and more coffee. Diana ordered toast and then did not eat it. Maxwell ordered a full breakfast and ate all of it, which told me something useful about his character. Sat at that table for 2 hours. Diana asked questions I had never been asked by anyone in my family. Real questions, curious questions, questions that showed she was genuinely trying to understand rather than perform understanding. She asked about the acquisition process, about what it took to build the investor syndicate, about whether I had always known this specific property was the one. I answered all of them. At some point, my mother called Diana's phone, and Diana sent the call to voicemail without looking up from whatever I was saying, which I noticed and which moved something in me slightly. When we finally stood up to leave, Diana hugged me at the table. It was different from the choreographed embrace at the wedding. This one had weight and duration, and the slight unsteadiness of someone who is not sure they have the right to ask for what they are asking for. She said, against my shoulder, "I didn't see you, Vivienne. I genuinely did not see you." I held on for a moment before I stepped back. "I know," I said. "I am letting you see me now." She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. Maxwell put his arm around her. I told them I hoped the rest of their honeymoon was everything they had wanted it to be, and I meant every word of it. In the weeks that followed, my mother called. Diana had told her. The call came on a Tuesday evening and lasted 47 minutes, which was the longest conversation we had ever had that was specifically and entirely about my professional life. My mother asked many of the same questions Diana had asked. She also said, twice, that she had not known, and both times I said, "Yes, I know that." She did not apologize directly, which is not her style. But near the end of the call she said, "I think we made it feel like you had to keep this separate from us." I said that was accurate. We was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I do not want to be the kind of mother you have to keep things from." And because I believed she was trying to mean it, I told her about the Michigan property I was working toward. She listened to the full description. She asked one clarifying question about what the Upper Peninsula designation meant geographically. When I answered, she said, "Vivienne, that sounds like a remarkable thing you are doing." She did not add a qualifier. She did not pivot the conversation. She just let the remark sit there and be about me. My father called 3 weeks later, 8 minutes, which is actually substantial for him. He asked about the property, about the valuation, about the capital structure, about whether I had business partners, practical questions, the language he knows. At the end of the call he said, "You got that instinct from my mother, you know. She had the same feeling for property. I should have seen it earlier in you." I told him it was fine. He said, "I do not think it was entirely fine. But I am glad I know now." For my father, those 2 sentences constituted a significant accounting. Diana and I began talking more after the honeymoon, not every week but regularly and differently than we ever had before. She visited me in Cincinnati in September, and I showed her the neighborhood I loved, the coffee shop where I did my best thinking, introduced her to 2 friends of mine who had been part of my life for years and whom she had never had the opportunity to know existed. She told me that the night before her wedding, she had felt completely certain about Maxwell and simultaneously uncertain about nearly everything else. "I think I was afraid," she said, "that if you were really included, if people actually knew you, you would take up more space than I had prepared for." I looked at her. "That is an interesting thing to be afraid of." She laughed with a note of self-reproach in it. "I know. It says something about me that I am not proud of." I told her that it said something she could change, and I genuinely believed that, and I still do. What I want to tell you, and what I did not fully understand until I was sitting in that restaurant watching Diana read a single page of documentation and revise 11 years of assumptions, is this. I had not hidden my professional life from my family as an act of protection. I had hidden it because I had stopped believing they were capable of receiving it accurately. And that belief, which I had held as though it were fact, had been doing damage on both sides for a long time. It had given me a privacy that also functioned as a wall. It had kept me safe from their small assessments, but had also prevented them from ever growing past those assessments, because I had not given them the material to grow with. The conversation at that table in Door County, And then the calls with my mother and my father. Those could have happened years earlier if I had been willing to risk showing my real life to people who might not have known how to hold it. Some of them might have dropped it. Some might have looked at it the way they looked at my graduation dinner, with love that did not know what to do with what it was seeing. But not all of them, necessarily. And I had never found out, because I had never tried, because I had decided they were not capable before I had properly tested whether that was true. I am not telling you to open yourself to people who have shown you clearly that they cannot be trusted with what is most important to you. That is a different situation. What I am saying is that sometimes the silence we maintain, the one that feels like wisdom, the one we built so carefully to protect ourselves, is also a decision to remain invisible. And invisibility, however much we have come to rely on it, is not peace. It is just a very quiet kind of waiting. The loudest thing I ever did was let my sister check into a resort that I owned. I did not announce it in advance. I did not prepare a speech or plan the conversation in detail. I simply let the truth exist in its own right, solid and documented and entirely itself, and I waited for her to arrive at it in her own time. That is the kind of power that does not require a raised voice. It does not require a confrontation or a prepared statement or even an audience. Though I will acknowledge that having a restaurant full of attentive Saturday morning diners in Door County was not an unpleasant context in which to let the truth do its work. If you are building something quietly right now, if you are the woman in your family or in your workplace who has been assigned a tier she does not fit, I want you to know something. The building is the point, not the moment when someone finally sees it, not the expression on their face when they realize how wrong they were. The building is the point, because what you are building is yours, and it is real, and it will still be there whether or not anyone ever acknowledges it. The acknowledgement, when it comes, is satisfying in the particular way that truth arriving is always satisfying. But it is secondary. What matters is what you made while no one was watching. What part of yourself have you been building in silence? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed to hear something like it, share it with someone else who might need the same thing tonight. Every comeback begins somewhere quiet. Every quiet place holds something being built.